Greg, your newest book, The Coddling of the American Mind, can you tell me what inspired you to write it?
Sure. Well, it was a long-term observation that I had going back to around 2007, when I started realizing that not only were a generation of administrators teaching students bad habits about free speech and due process, I also started to notice that I felt like they were teaching them dysfunctional ways of thinking about things that are the kind of behaviors that people engage in when they become anxious and depressed.
Wow.
And so I brought this idea to my friend Jonathan Haidt, who's a famous and brilliant sociologist who I was already a fan of his books. When I started seeing the shift from administrators kind of selling this sort of like you should be terrified and anxious about everything and everything's a crisis, because when I first started noticing it, students weren't buying it. They were rolling their eyes at it, being like, whatever, whatever, old dudes. But around 2013, 2014, you started seeing this first generation of like true believers, and they were all arguing medicalization. They weren't just arguing, I don't like this guy, or I don't like this speaker, I think they're a bigot, or I don't like them. They were really arguing, and I think quite sincerely, that having the speaker on my campus would be literally and medically traumatizing to me, which is, from a clinical psychology standpoint, just completely like dysfunctional. Like it's not a healthy thing to think. So I brought this idea to Haidt. We wrote an article about it in The Atlantic back in 2015, kind of predicting that the mental health situation and the situation for free speech were going to continue to get worse. And what was horrifying to us to discover after the article came out was that both the situation for free speech and for mental health were about to get much, much worse. And the stats that we talk about in the book for mental health are terrifying, particularly for the way they're hitting some of young women. And so it's hard in some cases to have compassion for some of the people who are leading the charge. But if all they've been taught is that if this speaker speaks on campus, this is actually going to harm my friends, then you shouldn't be surprised that they then believe in censorship. But unfortunately, one of the things we're trying to say is this is bad for free speech, this is bad for democracy, and it's bad for the students themselves.
If someone that is pro-censorship stumbles upon this interview, what would you tell them about the book in trying to get them to be interested in free speech?
It's one of these things where a lot of people who might be skeptical of the work that Haidt and I do might just dislike the title. They react sometimes strongly, Coddling the American Mind. And we're very clear in the book. All we mean is that some of our efforts to protect students and children are backfiring. So even if you think you're going to hate the book, give it a read. I think that you might find it much more reasonable, much more fair-minded than you expect. But as far as the philosophy of free speech, it's actually rests on a very simple premise. It's essential to know what the world looks like, what it really looks like. And chief among that is to know what people actually think and what they actually believe, not just even when it's something that you find disturbing or troubling, but especially when you find it disturbing or troubling. So in some cases, some of the solution to freedom of speech that universities should be leading the way on, by the way, is that people have to put on their scientist hat, they have to put on their anthropologist hat, and just be more curious about their fellow citizens and the people that they engage with on campus. Because if they were, you'd have a situation where people would do a better job of, I don't like your point of view. I'm going to sit down and hear you make it, hear you make an argument for yourself. And that would be an infinitely better situation than we have right now on campus.